Today, as we approach Chaf Sivan, we will replay an episode from last year about the history and significance of Chaf Sivan. As we will see, this day has an interesting history of being taken very seriously at first, only to eventually slip back into oblivion. So what happened on Chaf Sivan? How was this day observed? And when did it begin to fade? Chaf Sivan, the 20th of Sivan, is an important day on the Jewish calendar. Let's have a look at the Taz. The Taz is Eira Chaim, Siman Tov Kuf Samach Vav, writing in the 17th century. The Taz writes as follows: V'nirali, it seems to me, Da'atainus shegozru manhigei shalosh ha'aratzos b'tziruf go'inim, the tainus that was enacted, we'll talk a little bit more about the language in a second, Leis anos b'chol Chaf Sivan, to fast on the 20th of Sivan every year, Mishum Roya Hagzeiros, because of the terrible persecutions that occurred b'Avnei Neseinu Arabim. So in this situation, Yesh Likrois Vayechal Afilu Keshachal B'Yom Beis Oyhei. You're going to read Vayechal even if it falls Monday and Thursday. Monday and Thursday we read a regular Kriyas HaTorah. But if it Chaf Sivan falls on a Monday or a Thursday, then we push off the regular reading and we read Vayechal because of the tainus that we are having. And he concludes this note by saying, Shetainezehu kavua afilu b'yoyser mibeis v'hei. This tainus is set. It's permanent. Its importance exceeds that of the Monday and Thursday after Pesach and Sukkot, which is known as a tainus bahab. There's a concept of fasting a series of 3 fasts after Pesach and after Sukkot. The reasons for this fast is beyond the scope of this class. But during Bahab, when you're having a community that's doing Bahab, they push off the Kriyas HaTorah, the Parshas HaShavua, to read Vayechal. So if that's the case for Bahab, how much more so that would be the case for the tainus of Chaf Sivan? Because the tainus of Chaf Sivan is more permanent, is more integral to the Jewish calendar than Bahab is. This is what the tainus, this is what he says. What is the Gzeiris that he's talking about? Why is there a fast on the Chaf Sivan? The Taz doesn't elaborate and doesn't say anything about it. So this is something that will be a major focus in today's class. I should point out that he says that if Chaf Sivan falls out on Monday or a Thursday, we read Vayechal. It turns out that Chaf Sivan in our calendar can never fall out on a Thursday. It could only fall out on a Monday. Okay. Well, why is that? That's just the way the calendar is set up. In the Sefer Dvar Yom B'Yomai, the Sefer, every day of the year, he tells you what days it could and can fall out on. Okay. Now, who's the Shalosh Aratzos B'Tziruf Go'inim? What does this mean? When the Jewish people were given a charter to settle in Poland, they were given, unlike in many other places, a significant degree of autonomy to regulate their own affairs. So much so that it essentially operated as a state within a state. The Jewish communities had the powers of taxation, imprisonment, corporal punishment, and many other things that a government would normally does. And this had a lot of milas, probably had some chesronis as well. This organization had different names depending on the time. Sometimes it was called the Vad of Arba Aratzos, is the more common name, and sometimes it's called Shalosh Aratzos. This has to do with how many regions in Poland are part of the organization, and this it changed throughout history. But this was an organization that ran in the 1500s, in the 1600s, up until the time of the Baal Shem Tov, and toward the end of the Baal Shem Tov's life, it started petering out. And sometime in the 1760s, the Polish government closed it down and said, no more, we don't want to have a state within a state anymore. Now, B'tziruf Go'inim means that the way it worked is that Balabatim ran the show. Balabatim were in charge of this organization. It was political. They had to interact with the Polish government, but it was done B'tziruf Go'inim. All the important decisions were always made by the Gdolei Hador, had a serious say on all matters. They had a veto over things, and they would meet twice a year. The leaders would meet twice a year. They have these big summits, And the Rabbanim would get together, the Balabatim would get together. They would discuss all the big issues in Polish Jewry. And also, we know this was a great time for shidduchim. People would go to these big fairs, and they would make shidduchim for their children as well. So that's what the Taz means over here. That the Vad Arba Aratzos, or here he calls it the Vad of Shalosh Aratzos, they got together and they said that we're going to be fasting on the 20th of Sivan because of some terrible persecution that occurred, without telling us any information about it.
What year was this, you said this organization?
This organization of the Vad Arba Aratzos is from the mid-16th century into the 18th century. Well into the 18th century. Okay. Now there's also the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram is the same generation as the Taz, also doing the same work of writing a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And he was a little younger than the Taz, but he lived in the same era, and he writes in his commentary, Gam noyagin li'isanois esrim b'sivan b'chol malchus Poland. In the entire kingdom of Poland, we fast on the 20th of Sivan. Here he uses different language. He says noyagin. I'm not sure how much to read it. Great question. Does what we're learning here have anything to do with the custom of dafka reciting Avarachmin on Shabbos Mevorchim Sivan? So, as I'm going to explain hopefully later on, the answer to that is not really. But we'll get there soon. Okay, so he uses the language of Noyagin, which makes it sound a little more like a minig, which is less than the language of the Taz, where the Taz said that it's more kavua than Beis Vehei, more kavua than Bahab, and he used the language Shegozru, which sounds like it was a rabbinic enactment and a rabbinic chiyuv. Okay, this is going to play a role later on in this year. Okay, but what's our driving question now? Our question is, what happened? What that led to a fast on Chav Sivan? And the answer is, it's actually interesting that the answer is more than one thing. More than one thing. So let's start all the way in the beginning, and now we're going to do some time travel, and we're going to go back to the time of the Rishonim, the times of Bali Atosus. This is the year 1171 in France, to a little tiny place that is called Blois, B-L-O-I-S. Did I mention it? Possibly. And we have an account that is written in Sefer Azchira. Sefer Azchira was written by someone who lived during this time. Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn was born in 1132. And so in 1171, when this event happened, he was already an adult, and he wrote the way he understood the events, how they transpired and occurred. And this was transmitted in manuscript, and Jews had it for many centuries. And it saw a print for the first time in the 16th century in a history sefer. Someone quoted from him, and Rabbi Yosef HaKohen has a sefer, a history sefer that is called Emek HaBacha. And in Emek HaBacha he quotes from the story. So what's the story? Let's read the story. It happened in the year, I'm going to summarize in English as we go through this thing. I'm not going to read the Hebrew. It happened in the year 1171, where a terrible calamity fell upon the Jewish people in France, in the city of Blois, where there were about 40 Jews who lived in that city. It happened on one day, toward evening, that there was a Jewish rider who went to go feed his horse. And there was a soldier or servant who was there, may God erase his name, who was giving drink to his own horse. The Jew had in his on his body was carrying some sort of hide, some sort of animal hide with him. The horse of the non-Jew saw this hide. Somehow it became afraid of what it saw, jumped backward, and refused to drink from the water. Okay? So the non-Jewish servant gets all scared from this event, and he goes back to his master, and he decides to turn this, in short, into a blood libel. He says, "Listen, master, to what happened. I saw a Jew, and I followed him to the river to bring water to your to give water to your horse. I saw that he's throwing a small Gentile into the river, one who was killed by the non-Jews. And when I saw this, I got scared, and obviously the horse also got scared from the splash of the child being thrown into the water, and so the horse refused to drink." He knew, the servant knew, that his master wanted to hear this accusation, because he knew that his master hated a certain Jewish woman in the city, a prominent Jewish woman in the city. And therefore, he said what he said. And the non-Jewish master said, now I can take my revenge from this Jewish woman whose name was Poltzelina. He goes to the leader of the city. We know from other sources that the leader was a count. The count, his name was Theobald V. He goes to him and he tells him what happened. Theobald gets upset. He takes all of the Jews in Blois. Remember, there are 40 of them, and he locks them up in jail. Mrs. Poltzelina was giving everyone chizuk, strengthening their spirit. Why? She said that she has connections with the count, who really likes her very much. She's obviously someone who's a prominent woman. She's wealthy. She has connections with money, something of that sort. So therefore she's saying, don't worry, this is going to blow over soon, and we'll take care of this. Everyone was tied up except for her. However, the police, so to speak, didn't allow her to speak to the count. And the reason they didn't allow her to speak to the count, they were sure that had she spoken to the count, that she would have convinced the count to let all the Jews go, and so they didn't let it happen. Just goes to show how much influence she had on him. Now, at this point, what happens at this point in the story is they start monetary negotiations. And the question that Theobald has to the Jews is, how much are you guys going to pay for your freedom? They send a Jew. They ask this question. So what happens is that the Jews get together and they have a conversation with non-Jews and with, in other words, Jews who aren't arrested, aren't incarcerated. Meet with non-Jews, discuss what should we do, what should we give. They go to the prison and they meet the Jews who are imprisoned, and they come up with a sum. The amount of money that they're going to give is 100 pounds. Is 100 pounds, which is not a lot of money. The way it's written in the account is they didn't give an amount more than 100 pounds. Why is this? This comes back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ein poidin es hashvuyin yasar michemei demeyan. It is forbidden to redeem captives for more than their worth. Their worth being what they would earn on the slave market. And Jews were very sensitive to this at this period of time, with having the simple fear that if we're going to overpay for our freedom, what's going to stop them from taking us again in the future? There's a famous story of Maharam Rottenberg in this regard, but that's more than 100 years later. The bottom line is, they don't give a lot of money. They say, we'll forgive some of our debts. Remember, Jews are money lenders at this time, so many non-Jews owe money to Jews. So part of the concession is, we'll give you some money. We'll also release 180 pounds in terms of debts owed to us by non-Jews. And it seems like that was not enough to get their freedom. And then a priest came. No name is given for this priest, but this priest basically convinces Theobald that he should kill the Jews unless they convert. And that's what happens here. They take the Jews to a house. They prepare to burn it. They tell them on their way to this house that if you convert, that's fine, but if not, then you know what's going to happen. The account goes on to say over here how the Jews actually did something really interesting. You don't see this in many stories of our persecution. They took a non-Jew hostage with them and brought the non-Jew into this house, making it impossible for them to burn it because the non-Jewish person who was in there. But ultimately, they extracted the non-Jew from there, and they did. None of the Jews in this account are said to have converted, and they did put fire to the building, and it says that 32 Jews perished. In other words, there were 8 Jews in the city who did survive. The account goes on to say that their bodies were not harmed, only their neshama left, but their bodies were not harmed, and even the non-Jews attested to this. And then he ends off by saying, V'zeh haya, this happened Bishnas Tov Kuf Lamed Aleph, which is the year 1171. B'Revi b'Shabbos on a Wednesday. Be'esrim lachodesh Sivan on the 20th of Sivan. And Veroe lekoiva Yom Tzom Ketzom Gedaya. It is appropriate for this to turn into a fast like Tzom Gedaya. Who wrote this? Who wrote that it is appropriate for this to be a fast? Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn? No. Kechal hadvarim ha'ela kasvu b'Orleans be'ir hakroiva al Chalei hakodesh. About an hour's drive from Blois is the French city of Orleans. The people in Orleans wrote a letter, and they wrote to Rav Rabbeinu Yaakov. They wrote to this Rabbeinu Yaakov. We'll talk. This is Bapashas Rabbeinu Tam. They wrote to Rabbeinu Tam, and they're the ones who said, "Here's the story. What happened? We think this is so bad. This is like Tzom Gedalia. There should be a fast that is instituted for this." The letter continues. The narrative, the letter from Orleans went further and said that when the fire was going up in flames, they heard the Jews singing. What were they singing? They were singing Aleinu L'Shabeach. We spoke about this when we did a class on Aleinu L'Shabeach in Elul, because why they sing Aleinu L'Shabeach? We think of Shema Yisrael as being the thing Jews would say in this very unfortunate situation. But, as we showed then, Aleinu L'Shabeach was understood in this period of time as being a very intense anti-Christian polemic, and we showed how that worked with gematria and with censorship and with all of that. So it makes a lot of sense that Jews said Aleinu L'Shabeach. There is no mention over here of Shema Yisrael. One has to do research to actually find. We know the famous Gemara by Rabbi Akiva that he said Shema Yisrael when he was being killed on Mesiras Nefesh. But in terms of later generations, one has to do a little research to figure out where that starts. Maybe it's before this, maybe it's after this. I don't know. The account in Sefer HaZchira continues and says as follows. Where are we? B'Revi b'Shabbos be'esrim b'Sivan arba'as alafim tov kuf lamed aleph. So on that Wednesday, the 20th of Sivan, 1171, v'kiblu kol kihilas Sarfas ubiham v'Rainos. France, Bohemia, that's like Czechoslovakia today. Verainos, that's the Rhineland in Germany. Lehesped, Vitainis, Merotz, and Nafsham, they all agreed to do a hesped and fasting. Uve mitzvahs hagoyin Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Harav Reb Meir. But per the command of Yaakov ben Meir, Rabbeinu Tam's Yaakov ben Meir, right? His brother is Rashbam, Reb Shmuel ben Meir. Yaakov, his younger brother is Rabbeinu Tam, Reb Yaakov ben Reb Meir. Asher kasav aleim svarim, he wrote to them letters, v'oidiam, and he said, Ki ra'ihu lekavoi tzoim l'chol b'nei amenu. This should be a fast for all our people. It sounds like not just for the Jews in France, it's for all Jews should be a fast. V'gadol yiyah tzoim hazem et tzoim Gedalia, greater than tzoim Gedalia. In other words, in Orleans, the rabbis of Orleans sent a letter to Rabbeinu Tam and said, we think this should be a fast like Tzom Gedalia. Now, why exactly it said Tzom Gedalia, not entirely sure, but on the one hand, it's a fast associated with the murder of someone, whereas Tisha B'Av and Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Asar B'Teves are not about the murder of people. They're about national institutions. So the Jews in Orleans were looking for a precedent, and they said, Tzom Gedalia, a Yid was killed, and we made a fast. So here, many Yidden were killed, so we should make a fast. Rabbeinu Tam comes back and says, it's greater than Tzom Gedalia, ki Yom Kippurim hu. Yom Kippurim hu. Didn't explain what he meant by that. What do you mean by Yom Kippurim? Is he trying to say that it's more chamor the fast, halachically? Is he trying to say that the day is a day where atonement is possible? A Jew could achieve atonement on this day because of the Mesiras Nefesh that these Jews had? He didn't explain. Zeh Lashon Rabbeinu Asher Kasav. This is what Rabbeinu Tam wrote. So obviously, this story has a number of themes. There's the powerful Jewish woman who has connections, where it doesn't turn out in her benefit. She isn't able to pull the strings anymore. And the person who's writing the story felt the need to insert that into the narrative. There's the monetary aspect of it, the negotiation that then gets canceled when the religious fanatic, the priest, comes and says, no, it's or conversion or death. And then it's the story of Kiddush Hashem, the Jews saying that they refuse to do this and fighting back for themselves, but then ultimately giving up their lives in order not to deny, not to renounce their Judaism. Now, if this is Rabbeinu Tam, what's interesting about that? Rabbeinu Tam passed away, the best evidence we have suggests, without getting into the details, in 1171, the very same year. The very same year. There's a Ksav Yad that a rabbi found in the 1800s that says a siman. What's the siman? There's on the side of Rashi, there's a ksavya from Rashi, and it says when Rashi passed away, and then it says that Vayomer Elikim El Yaakov. His name is Yaakov, so he passed away. The siman is El. He passed away in the year El. El is 31. 1171 is the year, the tough kuf lamed aleph. Lamed aleph is El, and that's the siman to know that he passed away that year. Now, Seder Adoidus, written in the 1700s by Rabbi Halprin. Seder Adoidus writes that he saw a source that he died, that Rabbeinu Tam passed away on Dalet Tammuz. So now, if you take that, Dalet Tammuz, tough kuf lamed aleph, that's literally 2 weeks after this event. So Rabbeinu Tam hears about the event, says the fast is not a Tzon Gedalia, should be a Yom HaKippurim, and 2 weeks later, he passes away around the age of 70 years old. So when Rabbeinu Tam passed away, it's tempting, and people have done this, but there's no way to prove it, to say, it adds a little bit of a literary flourish to it if you say that the tsar of the event. Now, is it possible? Of course it's possible. It's reasonable. If reasonable, is there a way to prove that? There's absolutely no way to prove it. But this is... now, we may look back at this and say, hold on a second. Really? This is a terrible story, but there's so many terrible stories in Jewish history. What happened here that the Jews got so shook up that in Orleans they said, that's Yom Gedalia. And Rabbeinu Tam said, no, it's a Yom Kippur. What happened over here? This is the first blood libel on continental Europe, which means as follows. In the previous decades, there was a blood libel in England. Very famous first ones are in England. This is the first one that came to continental Europe. So for Rabbeinu Tam and the Jews who are living in France, this is the first blood libel that's in their backyard. This began, what we now know, a continuous history of many, many dozens of blood libels, many hundreds of blood libels, most of which we never even heard about. But it's something that continued after this, again and again and again. And not only was it a blood libel, the Jews were condemned by the government officials, which didn't happen in England. The government officials came and took the Jews and punished them collectively. What's also important to note in this story, there was never a body, there was never a dead boy, there was no missing child, there was nothing. What I failed to say before was, what was the evidence that was used in this case? The witness, they gave him a trial by ordeal. What is a trial by ordeal? He says that he saw. How do we know if he's saying the truth or not? We're going to put him in water. If he floats to the top, so then it's proof that he's saying the truth. If he dies from drowning, then it's proof that he's lying. And when they did the test, this account, Sefer Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn says, when they did the test, they manipulated it in such a way that he floated, and this was the evidence that was used to condemn an entire community. So this is the trauma that happens in this time, and a fast is instituted. And as you can see, at least initially, this is a very, very serious time. And now let's talk about some of the liturgy that was used at this time. Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn had a brother, and his brother, I believe, his name was Hillel, and he wrote a piyut. He wrote a piyut, a liturgical poem called Emunei Shlume Yisrael, that was read on Yom Kippur. You know, on Yom Kippur where we do that part of the Asar Erugei Malchus, and then what's happening there? We're talking about Jewish suffering. At a certain point, it's not entirely clear when and how, it was decided that in addition to talking about Slicha, Mechila, and Kapara on Yom Kippur, we should talk about Jewish suffering. And so we have the Asar Erugei Malchus. This is the Slicha section at the end of Musaf. They added a lot more. If you go through these old Machzorim, you see there's many, many more pages of other material. And they took in Ashkenaz, yeah.
It's like 30 pages.
Yeah, you're saying till today there are nuschos that have more material. So one of the piyutim is the piyut Emunei Shlume Yisrael. Now, it's not an easy read, but what you're able to see is it has a full account of this story. Let's look at some of the lines. Let's read the first paragraph. Emunei Shlume Yisrael, faithful and peace-seeking Jews, Gizrasam Kishoyam, who were formed and made out of sapphire stone, Netashtam, Zanachtam, God, you abandoned them and let them loose. Va'yisar Kigibar Nidham, and you were like a hero who's quiet because you didn't intervene. Besitcha biyad Tibolt Hamazoyham, by putting them in the hand of Theobald. Now what's interesting is that in later generations, people looked at this piyut, they had no clue what biyad Tibolt Hamazoyham, and they didn't know what Tibolt is. So they changed it, and in the later centuries it became Rasha Hamazoyam. But if you go back to the original Kisayad, you see that it says Tibolt Hamazoyam. Okay, that's the next paragraph. Be'esrim b'Sivan, the 20th of Sivan, goimer peiros u'mafriach, when fruits are completed. This is a reference to the fact that on Shavuos, probably, on Shavuos, it says fruits have their judgment. But taf kuf lamed aleph leprat, that's the year. Okay, next paragraph. Davar zek kisham nisratu yachad. They all, when they heard about their choice, they all agreed together. Kibisin, like with Sinai. Nasav and Isha lahashiv ke'echad. They all responded. Nasav and Ishmael, loyalty to God. Kulam b'nei ish echad. All of them are the children of one father. Mita mushlemesh mili kached. A complete bed. This is a story. Yaakov Avinu was mitasei shlema. All of his children served God, believed in Achdus Hashem. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So they followed in that tradition. Okay. 2 paragraphs down. Vayoimru lohoitzi oisan leveis hasreifa. It was said to take them out to be burnt. Yachtov samchu kachnachsas kala lechupa. They were happy like a kala going to the chuppah. Aleinu lishabeach shibchu benefesh kesufa. They praise God with the song Aleinu lishabeach, which we have in the other account. Hinach yafa rayasi hinach yafa. This is God, the male in Shir HaShirim, saying about his bride how beautiful she is. In the next paragraph, he talks about the number of deceased, and here we have a discrepancy. Here he says, "V'heim echad u'shloshim," it's 31. In Ephraim of Bun, we had 32 people who were killed. In the next paragraph, he talks about the women. There were women here that were killed as well. And in the next paragraph, you'll see the words, "V'ru'uyim likbaya tfilois azizos v'natsuma v'naksha u'nevaksha alzois." It is appropriate that we establish strong prayer in their memory, and that we fast, and that we pray for them, on behalf of them, inspired by them. And then in the next paragraph, remember Rabbeinu Tam said about Yom HaKippurim? Look what it says here. Pedus v'chapara yechoikeku liyishurun ba'sefer. Atonement will be given to the Jewish people. Yeshurun is the Jewish people. Tamoid schusam leumam kas lahafer. Their schus is going to stand for the Jewish people. And ala koyanim va'al am yechaper, and they will be an atonement for all of the Jewish people. So you see this atonement language built in to the piyut. This was said, as we said before, for many years in the slichis and the musaf of Yom Kippur, and perhaps there are some people who still say it today in their davening. However, if you look around at Jewish writings from the 1200s and the 1300s, although this piyut was said in the 1400s and the 1500s in Ashkenaz, although this piyut was said, and it was said every Yom Kippur, you don't really see anyone talking about Chav Sivan. You don't see any sources talking about fasts. When you look at the sources, the halachic sources, the minhagim sources that you have from this kufa, the 1500s is a lot. The 1400s is also a lot. The 13th, the 12th, you don't really see so much. There's very little writing that has on Chav Sivan. And that leads some people to believe. And you'll say
the reason why we say Al-Barachim.
We'll come back to Al-Barachim soon. We'll come back to Al-Barachim soon. So this is good reason to believe that somehow the tainus starts dissipating. The tainus starts falling apart. And by the time we reach the 17th century, it doesn't look like anyone is really fasting anymore. And that becomes very interesting. How do you have a fast that's so serious that Rabbeinu Tam said should be on the level of Yom Kippur, and that's for all Jews? How does it happen that it becomes forgotten? Is it because of immigration? Is it because Jews are moving? Is it because of other persecutions that are overshadowing? Whatever it may be, we don't entirely know. The reality is that by the time we come to the mid-17th century, there is no fast for Chav Sivan anymore. And that leads us to the next part of the story. In 1648, 1649, there was the famous massacres in Poland and Ukraine, the Chmielnicki massacres, Gzeres Tach V'Tat. In a nutshell, what happened here was that the Ukrainians revolted against the Poles. The Poles were controlling the territory and the money. They had everything. And the Ukrainians were basically serfs. The Jews were representing and agents of the Poles. And so as part of this revolt that the Ukrainians had against the Polish, they also killed many Jews. And this went on for a very long time, 2 years. Many thousands of Jews were killed at this time. There are a number of svarim and accounts that talk about what happened. Perhaps the most famous one is Rav Nosson Nata Hanover. Nassanata Hanover was an eyewitness to the accounts. He runs away. He writes a book and publishes it just a few years after. This is 1648-49 and 1653. He prints in Venice, or by this time you already have printing, he prints a sefer called Yevein Metzula. Yevein Metzula is words in Tehillim, where it says, Tavati bivein Metzula. I am sinking in, a Metzula is deep waters, but Yevein is mud. So I'm sinking in muddy, deep waters. But he called the sefer Yevein Metzula. You could understand why. But there's also something deeper that's happening with this name. The revolt, the war, was the Ukrainians. What was their religion? There was a religious issue here as well. The Poles were Catholics. The Ukrainians, as well as the Russians, are Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox. So while there's a lot that unites them, there's a lot that divides them as well. Like Adayom, for example, the Nittel is observed differently if you live in those countries. Why is that? Because they observe that their holiday on different dates. They're not part of the Catholic Church. They don't recognize the Pope. So part of this was also a religious war. In fact, primarily it was a religious war in the sense of probably more than a nationalistic issue. So that's Yavon is Greek. He probably has that in the name, Yevein Metzula. Now, let's summarize. This is a huge sefer. He discusses so many different elements of the persecution over a period of 2 years in so many communities in such a huge region. One, just for a small taste. It happened on Wednesday, the 20th of Sivan. The Cossacks came near the city of Nemirov. What did the Cossacks do? They made banners and flags that were similar to the Polish ones. The residents, the non-Jewish residents of the city knew that this was trickery. They told the Jews who went to hide in a fortress, open up! The soldiers who have come are not Ukrainian Cossacks. These are Poles who have come to help you. They opened the gate and they killed many Jews. Men, women, they raped the women. There were women who jumped into the around fortresses. It's often the case that there's a body of water. They jumped into that in order not to be raped. This is an example of suicide in order to avoid this, which is an interesting discussion about the permissibility of suicide under these circumstances, which is not our topic for today. He goes on to say that there was a Rosh Yeshiva in Nemirov. His name was Rabbi Yechiel Michal, the son of Rabbi Eliezer. He knew Kol HaTorah Kula Ba'al Peh. He was Baki in all the Chachmas Ba'ila. The Shabbos before, there was already trouble going on. This is not the first attack against the Jewish community in the year 1648. There had been other ones prior to this. And they knew about it. There was very limited things that they were able to do. And he gave a speech and he said that if the enemy comes, no one should convert. We should be Mekadei Shem Shamayim. And that's exactly what happened. Goes on to say that there was a young woman, a beautiful woman, from a very important family and a wealthy one, who a Cossack managed to kidnap her and to take her and to marry her. Before he managed to have relations with her, she said to him in a manner of trickery that she has the ability to do an amazing skula. No weapons could hurt her. Really? No weapons could hurt you? Yeah, really. Try me out. No weapons could hurt me. Take your gun. Shoot me. You're going to see. Nothing's going to happen. Well, this guy wasn't too intelligent, and he did that. And she obviously died. Now, what's happening here, he's telling us this story, that this is an example of the Kiddush Hashem that a woman had at this time in order to avoid conversion and living with a non-Jew. Okay. Now, you obviously notice that when did this happen? When did this attack on Nemirov happen? It happened on Chof Sivan. Let's hold that information. Another account that we have of these massacres comes from none other than the Shach. The Shach, we mentioned before the Taz, we mentioned before the Magen Avram, in that conversation of these great first-generation commentators on the Shulchan Aruch who lived in the 17th century, was the Shach, Reb Shapsi Kohen. He lived in Vilna, and he, after these events, wrote also piyutim. This is a very, although it happens not so much today, for a rabbi, a big Talmid Chacham, to write a liturgical poem after an event, after a negative event. And the Shach did so. He wrote slichas. He wrote slichas for Gzeirus Tachvata. And he also wrote an introduction, Hakdama. This was printed in Amsterdam in 1651. Again, right after, 2 years after. This is printed in Amsterdam, very far away, but this is where Jewish printing was excelling in this period of time. He called this introduction Megillas HaYefa. Okay. And he says as follows. He recounts what happened in Nemirov as well. About 50 people, they came into Nemirov using trickery. They killed 6,000 Jews. Nefashos Kedoshim. They destroyed the Beis Mikdash Mat. They destroyed the shul. Yes, this is Tachata. They took all the Sifrei Torah, the old ones and the new ones, and they tore them to pieces. And when did this happen? On Wednesday, the 20th, the Chodesh Sivan, a day that is cursed for us Jews, because also the Gzeira, he's the first one to kind of make the link, also the Gzeira of 1171 happened on that day. So he has memory, he knows about what happened in 1171, and he says, this is a problematic day. Chav Sivan is a problematic day. He then goes on to say, therefore, I have made for myself and for my descendants Yom Tzayim v'Tainis v'Evel u'Mispid v'Kinim, a day of fasting and a day of mourning. When? B'Yom Chaf l'Chodesh Sivan, on the day of the 20th of Sivan. Why? Jump a line. Yan ki Yom Zeh. He gives 3 reasons why he chose Chav Sivan as a day for a Tainus. Number 1, this day is the beginning. What does he mean, the beginning? The first real big attack on a big city is Nemirov. There were some skirmishes before, and so because we need to choose a day over a 2-year period, you need to choose the beginning. What's the beginning? Okay, Nemirov for him is going to be the beginning, and that's why he's choosing that day. Vigam, a second reason, because there are we have a long history with this day. Kigam Gzeiras Tov Tov Kuf Lamed Aleph, 1171, Hoysa Bayem Ahu, Uva Oysan Hazmanim, many generations ago. Vigam, a third reason, Ki Yom Zeh Lo Yera B'Shabbos Kodesh B'Shum Panim. The 20th of Sivan, I said before, it can't fall on a Thursday, it also cannot fall on a Shabbos, which means it wouldn't have the problem of pushing off a fast. And V'chabarti, he concludes, Elu Slichois V'Akinois B'Vchiu V'Sachnunim. I wrote these slichis, crying and with pleading, L'oimram b'yom zeh, to say it, b'chol shana v'shana, that it should be said every single year. Now you need to notice here, he's making like this fast is his own personal chumrah for his family, right? Why is that? He doesn't live in Poland. There's different regions. He's in Lithuania, and it seems that in Lithuania they weren't makabel the fast. He was makabel this fast, and so therefore he's making it personal. That may be the explanation for what's happening here. Okay, one more source about these persecutions relates to another Gadol B'Yisrael who lived at this time, none other than the Taisus Yom Tov. The Taisus Yom Tov lives far away. He's not in the line of attack. He lives in Krakow. Krakow was in Poland proper, not under attack at all. And he also wrote slichas. And the printer, when he printed the slichas, wrote a Hagdama. It's printers at this time called themselves a mechoikek because you're carving out the type, the metal type that you're using to print. So, Amar HaMechoikek, this is printed in Krakow in 1650, and the printer says as follows. And here he says like this: Kasher ra'u hakatsinim roizne me'arba haratzos. When you had the chiefs of the Vad Arba Haratzos, Roshayim, Manigayim, Va'alufim, Asher Berosham, Hagoinim, Rosh Yeshivas, Va'av Batei Din, B'Yoisam B'Izvadus, Tekilas Kodesh Lublin. They use the word Izvadus, not a Fabreng, and this is what I was saying before about the summits that they had. They came to Lublin, Ben Geula L'Geula, between Purim and Pesach, the Shana Zu, this year, Tov Yud Leprat Koton, the year 1650. So in the year 1650, Tachvatat is over. The leaders get together in the city of Lublin, which is where they gathered every year, and they have this summit. And Allah Hamuskam Beineim, and they agreed amongst themselves, Kiblu Aleim Va'alzanam Achareim, and they accepted on their children as well. This is not a one-time thing. This is for the future. That in all 4 of the lands are going to fast. They're going to fast on the 20th of Sivan every year. On that day, the factor, the day is chosen by what? Nemirov. The Shach gave us 3 reasons why Chav Sivan is a good day. They use 1 reason in this takana. Now, again, we don't have the takana. We have the printer telling us a summary of what the takana was. Okay. Excuse me. He then goes on to say the second factor. The second issue there was double persecution. She came milifnim. Hoysa by ganking zera ra b'shnas taf kof lamal aleph lefrat. Kamoisha nimsa b'slicha, as we say in the slicha of Musaf Yom Kippur that we spoke about earlier. And here they go the rules. 18 and up, you need a fast. Interesting, right? The age. 18 and up, you need a fast. A girl, 15 and up, you need a fast. If you're pregnant or nursing or sick, then they should give money for the fast. Everyone should really be giving money to tzedakah to support Laim de Torah. We're going to read Vayechal, Shachris Mincha, just like a regular Tainis Sibur. We're going to say Kel Malei Rachamim to remember, and we're going to say this Kel Malei Rachamim for them on every Yom Tif as well. So there used to be a Pinkas of the Vad Arba Aratzos. It existed. It existed maybe even into the early 20th century. This was this huge binder that this government body wrote all their decisions in. It was lost. No one knows today where it is. It's been no one has seen it since World War II. No one has seen it. So when people want to recreate what this binder looked like, they rely on bits and pieces. It says in a sefer, on this and this day and this time, the Vad Arba Aratzos said the following. So there's someone, a scholar by the name of Halperin, who went and collected all these bits and pieces, and this is the piece he has for Tachvatat. Because the printer of the Slichos in 1650 summarizes what the Vad Arba Aratzos did in order to make the fast after Gzeres Tachvatat. The printer then goes and says, so now I saw this, and I saw that Reb Yom Tif Lipman Halevi Heller, the author of the Taisus Yom Tif, wrote good slichis for a previous persecution that doesn't need to concern us here. Something happened to the Jews of Prague. And he wrote wonderful things. So I came to him and I said, no, you need to deliver a second time. And he did. And so hereby I'm printing it. This is the introduction that he writes to this. If you take these sources together, what do you see? You see, then we opened with the Taz. And the Taz says about Vayechal and about the Kfiyas, about the Gzeira of Shalosh Haratzos. Here he says a Shalosh Haratzos, but that aligns with what we have the printer here telling us that it was Arba Haratzos who also made a very, very serious fast on this day. The Shach again talks about a personal meaning. Before I said maybe it's because he's in Lithuania, maybe the Arba Haratzos isn't including Lithuania, but I'm not so sure about that. Maybe it's before, maybe he wrote that before the 1650, the other of 1650. I'm not entirely sure, and I also don't know what to make of the Magen Avram saying a lashon of minig, which again seems a lot softer than what we're seeing here in these sources. What's another thing we see in these sources? They're instituting a fast on Chav Sivan for an Ashkenazi community that all had origins in where? In Bohemia, in Germany, in the Rhineland, in France. That's where all the Jews in Poland came from. And yet, they're instituting a fast on the Chav Sivan. Why? Because by the 17th century, there is no fast for Chav Sivan. They knew about the event, but there was no fast anymore, which goes back to the point that I said earlier about it being lost, and now it's being brought back to life, so to speak. Now, there's another interesting thing from this Slichas, from the Taisus Yom Tif. And basically, at the end, he has a Misha Beirach that's printed. And the printer puts a Hagdama to this Misha Beirach. He writes as follows. When we found out here in Krakow about the terrible tragedy that happened in Nemirov, so the language here is important. Us, Kidei Lahasir, I'm reading number 8. Kidei Lahasir Michshel Ha'oven Hagadol Shal Sicha Shebebeis HaKnesses. So then, to remove the terrible sin of talking in Shul, Shahaseichel Oisroi, which common sense forbids it. How much, if we don't talk in front of a king of flesh and blood, how much more so we wouldn't talk in Shul. So to remove that problem, Yasad Goinenu, so therefore the Taisus Yom Tif made a Misha Beirach that the Chazan is going to say, Midei Shabbos b'Shabbos b'Kol Ram. And Ro'isi, me, the printer, I'm saying, Ki Toiv la'atfisoi gam kan, I'm going to put it here into the Slichis, Lizakos boi gam sh'ar akilis kodesh, so that other communities will see this. This is being said in Prague. Now, the language here is important. There isn't language here of that the Taisus, at least not here, that the Taisus Yom Tif said, you know why Tachvatat happened? Because Jews are talking in Shul. That doesn't have that language here, at least not here. What you do see here is that he right away said, there's a physical crisis and Sarah, we need to up our spiritual game. What's a problem we all know exists? Talking in Shul. Talking in Shul is a topic for another class. There's a long history of talking in Shul. Very, very long history. It's not a new thing. You see it here in the 17th century. There are other sources from this skufa, from before and from after, that are talking about this problem. And the Tosfos Yom Tov said, this is an area we need to get better at. And what does he do? He makes this Misha Berach. Turn the next page to page 4. Here's the words of the Misha Berach. Misha Berach, Aveiseinu Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov, Moshe v'Aaron David u'Shlomo, Hu Yevarech, God will bless. Hashomer pivu l'shoinoi melahafsik b'shum dibur min Baruch Shamar ad Gmar Tefillah. Remember, Ashkenazim, they start their davening. Baruch Shamar is earlier. Okay, so the person who doesn't talk from Baruch Shamar till the end of davening, uv'shas kriya sefer Torah shebetzibur, he's also not talking during kriya. Afilu b'divrei Torah, even if it's Torah words. Kol shekem b'sichas chulin v'sipurei shmois. Certainly, if it's nonsense and rumors, right? How does information travel in the Jewish community? Through shul talking. Okay. V'yachulu alav kol habrachas haksuvos b'Torah Moshe. He's going to have all the brachas. Uv'chol hanavuos. Yid zera kosher is going to have good children. Chayim v'kayim and healthy. V'yizkel l'shnei shulchanei sheb'shnei elamim. He's going to have 2 tables and 2 worlds. What are the 2 worlds? Olam hazeh and Olam haba. Look what he says about Olam hazeh. Sha'alav nemar v'hinei toiv. Very interesting. You don't find an emphasis in many sources about talking about the goodness of our world, the Vehine Toiv. I know it's in the first chapter of Bereshis, but there have been instances in where the Rebbe had to make the argument that, contrary to what you think, you should know the world of Vehine Toiv, right? Here you see that he put, in the aftermath of persecution and suffering, he puts the words about our way. He didn't need to be there. Somehow, the Baal Tosfos Yom Tov, Rabbi Yom Tov Lippman Alevi Heller, wanted people to think about this world as a good place. And he put it into this Misha Berach. What is the history of how long this was said, who said it, where it was said? That's something that I didn't look into.
So we should reinstitute it.
Oh, yes. We should reinstitute. Okay, so now, what happened in later generations? Happened in later generations is that we'll bring a few sources about Chaf Sivan. First of all, the Abderov, the Oyev Yisrael, who lived in the second half of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, he once gave a speech on Chaf Sivan. So just from that, we gain information that it was not uncommon for the rabbi to get up and give a speech on a fast day. What did he say? He said that Chaf Sivan is the beginning of the Haskalah of preparing for Yom Kippur. It's interesting because you have Elul. There are sources that say, probably Tu B'Av. So here you bring it up to Chaf Sivan. Chaf Sivan, and what's the remez? Ki Yod al Keis Yud Kei. So Keis is Chaf Sivan. Keis, Chaf Sivan. Yud Kei is Yom HaKippurim. And he said that there's a relationship between these 2 days. What's interesting about this is the Rabbeinu Tam that we had earlier. It's like Yom Kippur and the theme of kapara that you have in the piyut. So that makes it doubly interesting. Okay, now, I think the following source indicates, this is the 19th century, the following source indicates that Chaf Sivan here is falling back to its pattern. What's its pattern? A big kach, and very, very important to have a very, very serious fast that then people start forgetting about. Where do you see that? Rabbi Yosef Shaul Nathanson was one of the great Rabbanim in this century. And he has a sefer on Shulchan Aruch called Yad Shaul. And he writes over there that he once wrote a tshuva, though I didn't see if this tshuva is printed elsewhere or not, about Chaf Sivan. Let's read what he says inside. He writes, since 1648, people are fasting. But people have said in the name of a gadol, he doesn't tell us who, who used to say, that if he survives to the year 1841, I will nullify this fast. Why? This rabbi argued that they only accepted it al shnei meos for 2 centuries. So that's 1648 to 1841, close enough. Al shnei meos v'hadoros chalushes, and the generations are weaker now, right? We know this language from the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe. The weaker bodies, fasting is less of a derech and avodas Hashem, and so there's someone who wanted to come and get rid of it. Now, in my tshuva, he says, harachti bezeh. I went into great depth on this subject. When a community makes a ban and says everyone is bound by something, that's called a cherem. That's very, very serious. Shama kiblu elamis. Maybe it was accepted forever. However, I said, Kasafti, I wrote, Yesh Makam Lahakil, that you could be Makel. Why? Given the Bishnas Tavches, you could assume that in the year 1648, Bevade Lo Kiblu Rakad Mea Shana, they only wanted this fast for a century. Then it continued, and therefore you can be Makel because they're what's it called? A sunset clause. It has a sunset clause, it dies out after a certain amount of time, and just people continued as a minig. Now, if you just stopped here, correct. He's saying that when they made it 2 years after Tavches, 1648, they made it only for a century. Now, what's happening here? You already see voices here of saying enough. You see, now I have a hard time believing voices are saying enough when all the Jews are very careful on this fast. I don't think it's a big jump to say that already people were not so keeping it. Which is why Rabbanim were interested in maybe trying to find kulas that maybe it's okay not to keep it, which is why we're having this discussion. However, then he says something fascinating. However, he was the Rav where in Lemberg. Lemberg is also Lvov, today in Ukraine. Today they call it Lviv in Ukraine. They had over there the Pinchas of the Vad Arba Aratzos in Shul. Now, I don't know if this was the Pinchas of the official Vad, or every community had like minor copies of their own. And at Mavur Sham, it says here, the Bishnas Tov Yud in the year 1650, Nisasvu HaRoizmim, that same language that we saw before, Api Askamas HaRabbeinu HaGoinim, Shayu Be'esahu, V'tiknu, and they said, Shia Nikba Atainis Ledoire Doiris. We didn't have those words before. It was the mashmos, but we didn't have those words before. They made this for all generations. V'im came, Shuvei Makal Klal, no kulis. So therefore I'm only writing a brief, and I'm not writing what I wrote in my responsum, doesn't matter. So here you basically see something interesting. A movement and a tendency and arguments to be makel, but then someone who says, I checked the original source, and we can't. This is a fast that has to stick with us. Well, it didn't. Although it is true that there are Jews today, especially in some Hasidic communities, who do fast on Chav Sivan, and it's not an easy fast, it's a long fast. The vast majority of Jews, even that come from these regions, do not fast on this day. This day is the longest, it's June 21st, it's the longest day of the year. Wow. So it's Pashat, a very, very long fast. Now, the Rebbe spoke about this. And the Rebbe said that the Rebbeim did not fast on Chav Sivan. Let's see the Sicha Ba'aloischa Tavshan on Aleph. The Magen Avram schreibt, as Noegin Lis Anois Esrim B'Sivan B'chol Malchus Poilet, that is accustomed to fast on the 20th of Sivan. Afal B'Kein, haben Rabbeinu Nisienu sich azoi nit gefiert. Afilu in dem Zman, wenn Kveitus Mordechai Admur is given in Poland, und kam haben sich demult gefiert dort in fasten. In other words, Poland before World War II, there was a lot of fasting going on. And the Frierdiker Rebbe was there. The Frierdiker Rebbe did not fast. The Rebbe obviously observed that, and the Rebbe seems to be saying that the other Rebbeim also didn't fast, which probably means that there's a Mesorah, that the Rebbeim of Chabad, again, it's outside Russia is outside the jurisdiction of the Vad Arba Aratzos. So B'chlal, it could be that the Gzeira was never Chal over there. Fine. But this is the Frierdiker Rebbe did not fast even when he was in Poland. V'yesh Leimer, the Rebbe says an interesting thing. As das is nit be'ofen, as bei Rabbi Seinu Nisenu hat gefällt chas v'shalom die Meile von Tainis be'esrim b'sivim. There's something good that comes out of every fast. Whether it's kapara, whether it's spiritual rejuvenation, whether it's a time to refocus and recenter. You can't say that the Rebbeim didn't have these advantages. Somehow, you're able to get this through not fasting. Again, you need to see this, I think, in light of the movement away from fasting in sources, in Hasidic sources, and how this is not the right way to serve Hashem. But on the other hand, we're not going to admit that we're missing something. So what are we going to say? We're going to say that there's a different way. You could accomplish the same thing in other ways. That's what the Rebbe is saying here. And the Rebbe says that this is similar to the Maila of Purim over Yom HaKippurim. That what? It says in Kabbalah and Chassidus that Purim is higher than Yom Kippur. Why? Because the things you achieve Yom Kippur through fasting, on Purim you're able to achieve through celebrating. Now the Rebbe doesn't call for Jews to celebrate on Chav Sivan, but is saying that somehow these things could be accomplished through eating. However, the Rebbe doesn't say this. I would argue that's only the case if you know about the day. And if you know what it once was, and if you know what the history of the day is, so then if you take a moment to reflect and to think about what Chav Sivan is and what it was, and how it used to be observed, and how today we have a different way of serving Hashem, so then I think this becomes a force. This becomes something. But if we're completely oblivious to what the day is, then Yesh La'ayin, at least on a conscious level, if what the Rebbe is talking about here becomes something that's relevant. Okay. A few more small things to close out this shir. In Tav Shel Lamed Ches, there was someone who wrote to the Rebbe that he's having his vart on Chav Sivan. And the Rebbe responded that it should be after Shkia. This is reported by Rabbi Monshein in his collection of Minhagim with Shavuos. So that seems to be like, Chav Sivan is not a day to celebrate. On the other hand, Rebbe approved weddings on Chav Sivan. In Tavshin Mem Dalid, there was a chasana. The Rebbe negated a date, and then when they gave on Chav Sivan, the Rebbe accepted that date. And I don't remember who, but I remember hearing from someone clearly that he had a simcha, and it was Chav Sivan. He wasn't sure. He wrote to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said absolutely no problem, but I can't remember it right now. So that's interesting. Maybe there was a change in this regard from the earlier years to the later years. Okay, now let's come to Av HaRachamim. Av HaRachamim, I wanted to discuss in the next section, but we're not going to end up talking about the next section. I'll just give you a 1-minute summary of what the next section is. If I ask you after all of this, is it permitted after a tragedy to make a new fast? What's the answer have to be? Yes? Yes. It was done twice. It was done after the incident in Blois in 1171, and it was done after Gzeres Tachvatat in 1649. And this was done for a huge population of Am Yisrael, and it was done l'doidei doidus. So if someone were to say, let's make a tainus for what happened in World War II, could you come back to them and say that it's Hepech Halacha and Hepech HaMinig? It would seem not. Well, the reality is that that's what Gedolei Yisrael said in the 20th century. They said that it's Asr. Asr? How can you say Asr? Chav Sivan is a big issue for all of the Rabbanim who wanted to say that. So how do you manage that? How do you deal with that? How do you answer that? So there's multiple approaches, and that is maybe something that we'll save for another time because it's at least 20, 25 minutes worth of material. But in this, so that's one thing. Second thing is let's talk about Av HaRachamim, because that's where I plan to tie in, talk about the Crusaders a little, and Av HaRachamim. Av HaRachamim was instituted after the First Crusade, as far as I understand the First Crusade. The First Crusade attacked the Jewish communities in the Rhineland in the end of Iyar and the beginning of Sivan, 1096. Rashi was still alive. This is way earlier, 1096. Spire, Mayans, and Worms. How do we know that? Because there's a piyut that we read on Tisha B'Av that has the exact dates and exactly what happened in these 3 locations. This is the First Crusade on their way to Eretz Yisrael to take Eretz Yisrael away from them, to conquer it from the Muslims. They killed Jews in the Rhineland. Okay. Interesting, no tainus. There is no record of any tainus, even though this was a major shock to the Yidden of Ashkenaz. This is the first persecution that they really faced. So that's a conversation to be had. Why wasn't there a tainus? And that's part of the conversation that we need to have when we say, so Chav Sivan, are you allowed to make a tainus or not? You could say Chav Sivan is evidence for yes, but you could say 1096 is evidence for no, from the very fact that no tainus was made. But again, we're not going to go too far into that. This is where Av HaRachamim was made. My understanding, I didn't look into this recently, but a number of years ago, I once read, I believe. The original takana was to read Av HaRachamim only Mevarchim Sivan. That was the time that a commemoration was necessary. It later expanded to do it all year. So then we said, okay, we're not going to do it to Shabbos Mevarchim, but it always made sense that it should be retained for Mevarchim Sivan because that was the original takana. But that is not related to Blois 1171. And not related to Gzeres Tachvatat. It is interesting, however, that all of this is in Sivan. And we don't think of Sivan as a sad month. We think of Iyar as a sad month, Siras Omer. We don't think of Sivan as a sad month. We think of Iyar as Sivan as a happy month. So, but the bottom line is, if you're looking for persecution, there were persecution happened. I once worked on a project for this day in Jewish history. The initial draft was this day in Jewish history, every day. Another major number of Yidden were killed during the Holocaust, so it became ridiculous. So that's right, but that's true. Every single day of the year. So really, you don't have to go looking for times and places of Jewish persecution. Okay, so let's come back for full circle. We began with the history of of this day. We saw that there were, in the Bigadol, there were two major events. There's 1171, the first blood libel that happened in continental Europe, for which there was persecution by the government, and Jews were killed. Number one. Wasn't a blood libel. Wasn't a blood libel. Crusades was not a blood libel. Yeah. Massacres happened before. And then, 1648, the events, Nemirov happened at that time. You could already see in 1648 that we're going to make a tainus. Maybe they didn't want to. Maybe you have to add this into the conversation. Maybe they didn't want to institute something new. They didn't feel so comfortable doing it. And so maybe they're like, let's bring back something that already Rabbeinu Tam had in an earlier generation, which is part of that other conversation about new fasting, which we're not going to talk about. And ultimately, the Rebbe's points out that there is agreeing, so to speak, with the earlier sources. There is potential in this day. There is something special here. We saw Rabbeinu Tam talking about kapara. We saw the Apter Rav linking it to Yom Kippur. And the Rebbe says, also links it to Yom Kippur. He says that it's the Mile of Purim legabe Yom HaKippurim. So that's the third source, putting Yom Kippur into the conversation, but saying that within Yom Kippur, there's a way to do Yom Kippur with eating. That's Purim. And that's what Chav Sivan could be for us to think about. Practically, one thing to take away is taka to think about the talking in shul. It's taka something to think about given the relationship that it has to this day of Chav Sivan.